Hello everyone, this is Catherine, otherwise known as Kura Avonson, and today, at the request of Jackson's Ride, I'm going to talk about loom knitting. I'm not going to teach you how to do it. There's lots of videos and tutorials out there that are very good. I just want to give you an overview, like, what is it, and is it real knitting, and how does it differ from needle knitting or hook knitting, and the kind of knitting looms there are. So that's what the plan is. Yes, it's real knitting. The result is knitting. That was done with a knitting loom. So was this, and I have this example here, which you might not be able to see so well because the colour of the yarn, but this is knitting. Stockinette stitch, which is why it's curling up. It's just done with a different tool. And the people who say it's not real knitting, well, they just feel threatened by it. Probably because they feel that their own hard work is devalued if it's compared to something which is perceived to be easier to do. And loom knitting is perceived to be easier to do because it's marketed to kids, so it must be easy. And yeah, it is pretty easy. But people say that needle knitting's not that hard anyway. So, I mean, do you make a virtue out of things being hard? Or is it that you don't want kids in your little club? Anyway, the chief difference here is with hook knitting and needle knitting, all the stitches are on the needle or the hook, whereas with a knitting loom, each stitch is on a peg. Each stitch has its own separate peg that it lives on. This has advantages and disadvantages. It means it's easier not to drop stitches because you just have to forget to do a stitch or something in order to drop it. Though you can drop it while you're pulling it over, but it's easily grabbed. You will notice straight away that it didn't work, unlike with needle knitting where it's sort of like, oops, I missed that one out, and you don't notice it until several rows later. So the consequences of having your stitches on pegs have advantages and disadvantages. One advantage is, as I said, you're not as likely to drop the stitch. Disadvantage, you can only knit as wide as your loom. You can only do as many stitches as there are pegs on your loom, unlike with needle knitting, where you can put a lot more stitches on your needle. As you can see here, it shrinks because the tension here is quite tight and there are gaps between the stitches, and then it's just pulling itself together so that the stitches are right next to each other. Things that loom knitting is good at, things that loom knitting is not good at. Loom knitting is good at doing things in the round because you can just keep on going round and round and round and round. It's also fabulous at double knitting. And you say, well, what's double knitting? This is double knitting. You notice that this is like stockinette on both sides. You say, what? Well, you do it with a knitting loom like this. Instead of just doing on one side or going around and around, what you do is that you knit across, backwards and well, more like this. You set your stitches up and backwards and forwards, and noticing they're crossing over, and basically what that gives you is an interlocked double-sided knitting where it's not hollow. This thing is, you know, solid because it's interwoven, but you're getting stockinette on both sides. I love it. It's my go-to for when I'm making scarves, because you get these nice thick scarves and they don't curl up, and it's all pretty stockinette on the outside. Though you can, you know, do other patterns, you know, knit purl. You can do purl stitch on this. I've just been demonstrating knit stitch, not knit pitch. Things that knitting looms are terrible at: cabling. You try to do cabling with a knitting loom and you will end in tears, because the stitches are on quite tight, and with cabling you have to move the stitches. Even trying to do just a single crossover cable is... I'm not going to try. You have to get your stitches extra lax in order to pull them across, and then because they're extra lax, the actual cable is messy looking. So even though I have in the past done some simple cabling with knitting looms, once I learned how to do hook knitting, it's never again with cables on knitting looms. Hook knitting is the best for cables. There are different kinds of looms, as you can see here. This one's made with pegs, and they have little slits in them. That's just to help the pokey tool get through the loop of the stitch. This one is done with little wire hoops. You'll notice that they're bent out a bit. That's to help prevent the stitches from just sliding off. There are smaller ones of that style, and even smaller ones. Yes, this is a knitting loom. It's also a French knitter or a spool knitter, but the only difference between this and this is the number of pegs. That's all. The technique is exactly the same. You can also have single-sided looms rather than a long straight one or a round one. Well, this is not round, it's sort of marquise shaped. The only round ones I have are the small ones. Right, small round one. I don't have any big round ones. This is single-sided, and it's enormous. And I made this because I was frustrated because I was unable to buy a zippy loom in Australia due to stupid international agreements and local distributors not actually selling them. So I made one. This obviously isn't a zippy loom because it doesn't lock together, but it's a big loom, and hey, I made it myself. At some point I will decorate it. Now this wonder of the steam age is a sock loom, and it's adjustable. That's why it's a sock loom, because it's used for making socks with, so that you can actually adjust the size of the loom to fit the right sock size, and also, you know, when you're increasing and decreasing. And yeah, when you think about it, hey, wait a minute, you can't change the size of the other looms. Yeah, you can't. That's one of the disadvantages. With the sock loom, and no, I haven't made any socks. The slight disadvantage of this is that it gets a bit awkward when you're doing the corners. Well, these corners. But otherwise, it's a nifty bit of technology. And then there's this one, which is an adjustable loom. You just pull the peg out and change this around to a different width, so that you can basically change the gauge, sort of this. Speaking of gauge, every loom has a specific gauge, and that's been one of the frustrating things for me, because the default looms that you can get, the plastic ones, whether they're the straight double ones or the round ones, are all designed with a big gauge, which means you can only use chunky yarn with it. And that's one reason why I bought this one, because you can use thinner yarn with it. In fact, you can't use chunky yarn with it because it won't actually go between the pegs. But you try to use, you know, smaller sized yarn with this, and well, I suppose if you wanted a lace shawl you could do it, but not if you want something with stitches that are closer together. So I went scouring the internet, which is how I bought these ones. They are handmade, and those are cotter pins. They also make pretty good loom knitting pegs, because the wider bit stops the stitches falling off, and you can put them much closer together. These two are the same in area, but this one has a smaller gauge than this one, and these particular looms are designed for making cowls, that is the kind of scarves that go around your neck in a circle. So it's designed to fit around your average adult neck, and I've found these particularly good if I want to make ruffle scarves with some ruffle yarn. Some kinds of ruffle yarn I find trickier to do crochet with than others, and they suit those particular looms more easily. From one extreme to the other extreme, I also made these tiny little looms because I wanted to be able to make cords for my jewellery that weren't limited to just being 4 stitches wide. I wanted to be able to use finer thread and make a cord with more stitches per row. So, yay. Another disadvantage of knitting looms is, now I'll just show you, I will do a row of purl just to demonstrate that you can actually purl with knitting looms, because purl is just a backwards knit. But if you're trying to talk about slip knit or various other fancy knit stitches, the thing is you can't follow the needle knitting directions because they just don't correspond. You know, you can say, hey, yeah, I can do a knit, I can do a purl, I know how to do those, but if it's something more complicated. And the other interesting but confusing thing in regard to loom knitting is, as you may have noticed, you don't turn your work. You go along one side and then back in the other direction. This means that any needle knitting patterns need to be translated before you can use them for loom knitting, because you basically, every other row, you have to reverse it in direction and stitch, because if you're on row 1, then you would do what you would do on row 1 for same with loom knitting and needle knitting. Row 2, however, with needle knitting, if your pattern said purl this stitch, you would have to knit it. And if the pattern said knit this stitch, you would have to purl it, because the needle knitting, they've turned it around, and if you're doing a purl from this side, it's a knit. So you basically have to reverse all the stitches. You know, knit, purl. And so that means that when you're doing needle knitting and you knit one row and you knit the next row, the result will be garter stitch. But with loom knitting, if you knit the first row and knit the second row, the result is stockinette. So that just has to be kept in mind. The things about it are reversed. I hope that gave you a bit of an overview as to what loom knitting is and how it differs from needle knitting and hook knitting. If you have any questions, please ask. If you have any requests of something for me to film, please ask. I may do it, like this. And you shall see me in the next video. Bye.